Good morning and welcome virtually to the University of Glasgow and our Scottish election webinar with the Institute for Fiscal Studies and Scottish Policy Foundation. My name is Graham Roy and I'm Dean of External Engagement at the University of Glasgow, and it's great to see so many people joining us today for what promises to be a fascinating and lively discussion.
And I'm Alison Moore, Director of the Scottish Policy Foundation and co-chair for today's event.
So the format of the webinar is that we'll hear a couple of presentations from the team at the Institute for Fiscal Studies before opening up for questions. Now, questions can be typed into Slido with the link on the IFS webpage and also the YouTube link. If you could type your question into the Q&A function, that would be appreciated. You can also vote for the question that you want to see asked, and we'll do our best to get around as many questions as possible. Now, before hearing from the IFS, Alison, can I ask you to say a few words about the purpose of this research and also the work of the Scottish Policy Foundation?
Thanks, Graham. Let me say at the outset that we're delighted to see such a big audience for this, our flagship event in our election programme. Thank you to the University of Glasgow for hosting this event. For those who don't know, the Scottish Policy Foundation is Scotland's grant-giving foundation for public policy research. Our foundation has funded the research by the Institute for Fiscal Studies that we are going to be discussing today. And we think that their work has made a real step change in the policy debate in Scotland, shining a light on the economic context for these elections. This is the first time that the IFS has provided an analysis of the Scottish Government's record. The first part of their work was to prepare 3 research papers, one on the fiscal context, one on taxes and benefits, and one on public service spending. The second part of their work focused on the manifestos of the 3 biggest parties for the coming elections next week. Like everyone here today, I'm very much looking forward to hearing from the team at the IFS on their insights. And so without further ado, let's introduce the IFS team who will be presenting their research today. Later on, we'll hear from Stuart Adam, Senior Research Economist at IFS. But first up though, I'd like to introduce Associate Director David Phillips, who will kick off the presentations.
Thank you, Alison, and good morning, everyone. So before discussing the parties' manifestos, I think it's worthwhile spending a few minutes looking at recent trends in Scottish Government funding and public service spending. This will help explain the fiscal and policy context in which this election is taking place, and allow us to assess whether the party's plans represent a break from recent years or more of the same. Okay, so in 2020-21, the Scottish Government's budget for day-to-day resource spending was around £45 billion. Around £21 billion of this was regular block grant funding from the UK Government and the Treasury, with around £9.5 billion of additional COVID funding. Devolved taxes and borrowing accounted for the remaining 1/3 of funding, with the lion's share of this coming from income tax. And excluding temporary COVID funding, Scottish taxes now make up over 4/10 of funding for resource spending, a huge change from 2016 before the devolution of income tax. Nevertheless, the majority of funding still comes from the UK Government and UK-wide taxes, and it is changes in this funding that has driven trends in the Scottish Government's budget. For example, it was cuts in UK Government funding as part of austerity measures during the early to mid-2010s that saw the Scottish Government's resource funding fall by 6% between 2010 and 2017. And it's a subsequent loosening of the purse strings by the UK Government that explains most of the subsequent increase in the Scottish Government's core resource funding since then, even putting to one side temporary COVID funding. And these increases mean that funding is set to be 3% higher than 2010 by next year, although that's still a cut of 1% per person after accounting for population growth. So still a sort of tough outlook. Now, UK Government funding also explains the much higher levels of overall funding per person the Scottish Government receives. Core non-COVID funding for devolved public services is expected to have been over 30% higher per person than what was spent on comparable services in England last year. This is almost entirely driven by relatively high levels of UK government funding, with the net effect of Scotland's devolved taxes and borrowing making only a minor contribution. Higher funding allows higher spending on virtually every area of public spending in Scotland. Capital spending is particularly high, 30% higher than the UK average over the last 20 years, and around 51% higher than in England outside of London. Education has also been a notable priority, but unfortunately outcomes have been lagging. More is spent on early years, on schools, on further education, and on higher education, not least in the last case because of a policy of free tuition. Spending on schools is around £1,000 more per pupil than in England, a gap that has been increasing over time as the Scottish Government has relatively prioritised education spending. But unfortunately, this hasn't translated into a relative increase in performance. Scotland's performance on the international PISA tests has declined relative to England, and higher education participation has gone up by less. And I think the lesson from this is that whilst funding can matter, funding isn't the only thing that matters for policy outcomes. Much more is also spent on a range of smaller service areas, including housing and community development, recreation, culture and religion, environmental protection, and transport. Now, spending on health is also higher in Scotland, but official Scottish and UK government estimates suggest this gap has narrowed over time. Spending in Scotland was 22% higher per person in England at the outset of devolution in 1999, but this gap had narrowed to 10% by 2009 and just over 3% by 2019. And that's because while the Scottish NHS has seen big increases in funding over the last 20 years, the increases in spending have been smaller than in England, an increase of around 2/3 compared to a near doubling over the border. And that's despite overall funding growing at a broadly similar pace. And this suggests that both Labour and SNP administrations in Scotland have prioritised increases in health spending to a lesser extent than governments in Westminster. Instead, increases in other areas like education and social care and a range of other smaller services have been prioritised relatively more. Spending on adult social care, for example, is now estimated to be around 43% higher per person than in England, up from 27% in 1999, with this only partly explained by the offer of free personal care. Even so, the gap for combined health and adult social care spending has also narrowed over the last 10 and 20 years, suggesting that it's not just the higher social care spending that explains the slower increases in health spending. Turning to the future, provisional UK government spending plans are very tight for next year. Indeed, the indicative spending envelope set out imply unprotected departmental budgets will be 8% lower next year than planned pre-COVID, and that's despite the additional pressures public services are likely to face. Now, the Barnett formula means the Scottish Government's budget will be affected by this. The core non-COVID resource budget could increase by just 1% in cash and real terms between this year and next. The squeeze this could imply will be exacerbated by the fact that the current Scottish Government is funding a range of permanent measures from temporary COVID cash this year. This includes the start of a rollout of free school meals to all primary school children, free bus travel to the under-22s, and extra for councils to enable this year's council tax freeze. This will need to be found within core budgets in future. And so without extra UK government funding, increases to Scottish taxes, cuts to some areas of spending will be likely next year, even before thinking about paying for the various parties' manifesto plans. So let's now turn to those plans. And upfront, I should say that time and resources have meant that we've been only able to look in depth at the manifestos of the three largest parties, the SNP, Scottish Conservatives and Scottish Labour. But that doesn't mean that the issues I'm about to raise don't apply to the other parties' manifestos too, to at least some extent. Okay, so let's first look at plans for NHS spending. The SNP have focused on a headline figure of a 2.5 billion or 20% cash terms increase by 26-27. The Scottish Conservatives headline figure of 2 billion is actually for this year before, so is actually a broadly similar increase. But both parties say they would pass on any funding the Scottish Government receives via the Barnett formula as a result of increases in English NHS funding to the Scottish NHS. And the English NHS's current 5-year funding deal means that this will amount to around a 1.5 billion increase by 23-24, so over the next 2 years. Now, given this, the figures set out for later years by the Conservatives and SNP would imply very little in the way of real terms funding increases for the Scottish NHS after 23-24. And it's simply implausible there'd be enough to keep pace with rising demands and costs. And in my view, highly doubtful that the English NHS will see such lean years, as the SNP seem to suggest. Now, the Conservatives' figures is also just inconsistent with their double lock to also guarantee the Scottish NHS an increase of at least inflation plus 2%, whatever happens to England's spending. Given current inflation forecasts, we think that this would require a £2.6 billion increase by 25-26, over a quarter more than the figure they have headlined with. And if English NHS spending were to continue to increase in line with the recent trends, both the Conservatives and SNP would need to allocate almost £4 billion a year extra to the Scottish NHS by 26-27 to meet their pledges. Now, given this, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that both the Conservatives and SNP have downplayed the likely increases in NHS funding they would have to provide in order to flatter the amount available for their myriad other pledges. Scottish Labour, of course, don't even offer a figure for how much they would allocate to the NHS after this year. But it's hard to imagine that they would be comfortable providing less than the Conservatives and SNP, not least because of the sort of hints at a broader service offer and higher pay that they make. So despite trying to keep their head down on the figures, I think Scottish Labour would find themselves very much in the same boat. Turning to other areas, first, social care. The SNP and Labour plan a national care service, whilst the Conservatives are in favour of councils remaining in control of social care. All three support national employment conditions for care workers, with Labour also saying they would introduce an immediate £12 an hour minimum care wage for the sector, rising to £15 an hour by 2026. Those would be a big increase in pay in what's a low-paid sector. The SNP pledge a 25% or £800 million increase in social care funding by the end of the Parliament, and that would include funding to end all non-residential charges. Labour pledged an immediate £667 million increase in funding to pay for higher wages and an even bigger expansion in the care offer, but they provide no longer-term figures, although certainly the cost would rise substantially over the Parliament. The Conservatives also provide no specific figure for social care funding, presumably because it's covered by their council funding guarantee, which pledges a fixed share of the Scottish Government's budget to councils. Now, this is just an ill-thought-out policy. To see this, consider what would happen if the UK Government announced a top-up to English NHS spending. The Conservatives' health double lock would mean they would have to allocate the resulting funding to the Scottish NHS. But their council funding pledge would mean councils receive their share of this funding too, to maintain their share of the overall budget. And other areas of spending would then have to be cut, because effectively part of the Barnett consequentials are promised twice. The Conservatives have really got themselves in a bit of a knot over this issue. Moving on to childcare, the SNP plan to extend the current offer of 1,140 hours a year of free childcare to parents of disadvantaged 1- and 2-year-olds, plus provide subsidised wraparound childcare for school-age children. And together, they estimate these policies would cost around £540 million a year when fully rolled out. Labour is primarily focused on preschool children, They would start by extending the current 1,140 hours to all 2-year-olds and disadvantaged 1-year-olds, and then increase the hours available. In the longer term, their aim would be to increase entitlements to 2,600 hours per year for all preschool age children. That's 50 hours per week all year round. Now, their initial plans would cost a similar amount to the SNPs, but their longer term plans would cost several times more. I mean, a change to the whole funding and operating model of the childcare sector. So whilst it's obviously probably welcomed by many parents, it would be a big change and an expensive change. In contrast, the Conservatives' offer is more limited and targeted at school-aged children, with 5 hours a week of free wraparound childcare estimated to cost around £140 million a year. Turning to schools, plans and promises on teacher recruitment, the curriculum, and free school meals actually look remarkably similar across the three largest parties. COVID recovery plans differ in detail and scale, although again there are some similarities. The SNP say they plan a funded catch-up programme of support and summer clubs, but provide relatively little detail on the approach or cost of this. The Conservatives say they would spend around £160 million over 2 years, mostly on a catch-up premium for schools and tutoring. Labour propose the biggest amount of spending on this area, around £290 million this year, with individualised catch-up plans for students and more ambitious summer clubs. But actually, this is one area where potentially more will be required than all the parties are planning, given the loss of learning during the lockdown. What these parties do focus on is employment and training. The SNP say would guarantee 16 to 24-year-olds a place in university or college, an apprenticeship or job, and also say they would provide £500 million extra over the Parliament for training. Perhaps Labour's most striking proposal of all is a guaranteed 6 months of public sector employment this year for all under 25s and disabled adults who are not in work or education, and all other long-term unemployment adults. That would cost around £500 million. Now, done well, this could be a stepping stone to more sustained employment. We should not underestimate the challenge of rapidly creating and managing many tens of thousands of meaningful jobs with appropriate learning opportunities and links to permanent employers. Done badly, this could become an expensive make-work scheme. Labour also proposed a more permanent policy of £500 training grants for those on universal credit, with a £750 income top-up too. The Conservatives focus on training for all adults and propose a £500 a year training fund that all adults could use. Now, with all these policies, it'll be very important to ensure that training is high quality to make sure that it's actually valuable to the people taking part. And it will also be important to take action to avoid fraud that can sometimes occur with these sort of training schemes, which actually did occur in England with the lifelong learner accounts. Okay, so let's take a step back. Are these and the other commitments and ambitions in the manifestos actually affordable? To think about this, let's consider the potential path for the Scottish Government's budget over the next Parliament. The parties have supposedly based their plans on the Scottish Government's medium-term financial strategies central scenario, which projects that core resource funding could increase by £4.9 billion in cash terms over the next 4 years. Although we think that actually current UK Government spending plans imply a somewhat smaller increase in the Scottish Government's budget than this. Now, increases in NHS and social care funding could quite easily absorb 3/4 of this cash terms increase, even before considering increases in the generosity of provision or what would be needed to pay for substantially higher wages. And with this in mind, it is difficult to see how the party's billions of additional commitments and ambitions could be paid for without increases in Scottish taxes or cuts to at least some other services, or substantial increases in UK government funding. Now, I think some increase in UK government funding should probably be expected in the coming spending review this autumn, but probably not on the scale needed to fund these manifestos. And on that cheery note, I will hand over to Stuart, who will discuss taxes and benefits, including some of those perhaps doubtful ambitions.
Thanks, David, and good morning, everyone. Over the past few years, Scotland's got much more control over its own tax and benefit policies. Almost a third of Scottish taxes of tax revenue raised in Scotland now comes from devolved taxes. Most of that is from Scottish income tax, about 70% or £12 billion. Almost all of the rest comes from property taxes, that's council tax, business rates, and land and buildings transaction tax. On the benefits side, about 20% of benefit spending in Scotland is now devolved. That includes most benefits for people with disabilities and for those caring for people with disabilities, some smaller benefits, and crucially, the Scottish Government can top up UK social security benefits, and in practice, that's a lot of what it's done so far. Finally, the Scottish Government has power over some aspects of universal credit, though mainly the way it's paid rather than the amount that people are entitled to. What's the Scottish Government done with these powers? Well, there's a strikingly consistent theme in what it's done. It's been making the system more progressive, both over time and relative to the rest of the UK. We've seen tax rises at the top and giveaways at the bottom. And almost all of the devolved taxes and benefits have followed this pattern. Now, to quantify this, we can't model all of this and trace through all of the impacts to households, but at least for income tax, council tax, and the main social security benefits, what I'm going to show you is the effect of changes in devolved tax and benefit arrangements since 2016. So that is to compare the current situation with what would have happened if there'd been no further devolution after 2016, so Scotland was still using UK income tax and benefit rates, and if there'd been no real terms changes to council tax, which was, of course, already devolved. So we divide all Scottish households into 10 equally sized groups based on their income. And if you look first of all at the all bar on the right-hand side, you can see that the changes on average are a net tax rise. They cost Scottish households about £270 a year on average, or 0.8% of their income. But the pattern varies sharply across the income distribution. The highest income tenth of households, it costs them almost £2,000 a year, almost 2.5% of their income, whereas on average, the lower income half of the population have gained. So what else can we say about the Scottish Government's record? Well, broadly speaking, I would say that the benefit changes have tended to make life easier for claimants, whereas in contrast, the tax changes have made the system more complicated, and particularly in the case of income tax, unnecessarily complicated. What I'm going to do in the rest of this presentation is to go quickly through each of the main devolved taxes and benefits and talk more specifically about what the Scottish Government's done and about what each of the three biggest parties, the SNP, Conservatives and Scottish Labour, are proposing at the election. And I'll then step back and summarise where the three parties stand. Now, I'm going to focus here on permanent changes to tax and benefit policy. There have also been temporary measures to address the COVID crisis, and all the parties want to do more on that. But most of the action in terms of addressing COVID through the tax and benefit system has been at the UK level, and these are only temporary changes, so I'm going to focus on the long term. Let me start with the biggest tax, income tax. And this chart shows the income tax rates currently in place in Scotland and in the rest of the UK. So how do they differ? Well, where there used to be a long basic rate band in Scotland, Scotland, the Scottish Government has now introduced a little 19% starting rate band and a 21% intermediate rate band either side of the 20% basic rate. It's also added a penny to the higher and additional rates of income tax. Just as an aside, if anyone's wondering what this hump is in the middle, that's where the personal allowance is withdrawn from those with incomes above £100,000, essentially creating a high effective income tax rate in that band. But the biggest difference between Scotland and the rest of the UK isn't in these changes in rates, it's in the high rate threshold, which is significantly lower in Scotland, basically because the UK government decided to raise the high rate threshold to £50,000 and the Scottish government decided not to. Now, the result of all of these differences is that for those with incomes below about £27,000, that's just over half of Scottish income taxpayers, they pay a bit less in Scotland than they would in the rest of the UK, but it really is only a bit less, about £21 a year. Whereas for the top half of taxpayers, those with incomes above £27,000, and particularly higher rate taxpayers, pay quite a lot more. So for example, someone on £50,000 will pay almost £1,500 a year more in income tax than they would in the rest of the UK. Now, of course, it's a quite legitimate and reasonable thing for the Scottish Government to do, to decide it's going to cut income tax a bit for the bottom half and increase it quite substantially for the top half. But that could have been done without having separate 19, 20 and 21% rates of income tax. That really does look more like a political statement than a sensible way to achieve economic objectives. So where do the parties stand on income tax in this election? Well, interestingly, they all leave themselves a bit of room for manoeuvre. They talk about aims and ambitions rather than firm promises. And actually, that's probably sensible. Income tax is by far the biggest devolved tax, and they don't know what their fiscal position is going to be over the next 5 years. So it's probably sensible to leave themselves that bit of flexibility and instead give a sense of direction of what they want to do. On that, the SNP, of course, have been in power and are largely responsible for the income tax schedule we currently have in Scotland. And unsurprisingly, therefore, they don't really want to change very much. The Conservatives would like to introduce income tax cuts, but only when they can afford to do so. And they say that by the end of the Parliament, they would seek to align rates and thresholds of income tax back with the rest of the UK, except that they would keep the 19% starter rate. So in other words, they want to undo the Scottish Government's tax rises for the higher income half of taxpayers and leave income tax slightly lower than it is in the rest of the UK for all taxpayers. But to do that, they would need to find around £400 million a year. And so the when we can afford to do so caveat might be quite important. Scottish Labour say they would seek to avoid increasing income tax at the moment, but if they did need extra revenue, they would support increasing income tax for those earning above £100,000. The second biggest devolved tax is council tax. This chart shows how much council tax you'd have to pay in each council tax band in a local authority setting the Scottish average council tax rate, and how that compares in real terms with 2016. Now, since 2016, basically two main things have happened. First of all, following 9 years of freezes before that, the last election, councils have been allowed to raise council tax rates. So council tax has gone up a bit almost everywhere, although less than in England, and it's been frozen again in the current year. But the more dramatic change was in 2017 when the Scottish Government increased the relative tax rates that apply to the top 4 council tax bands, bands E to H, which covers about a quarter of all properties in Scotland. And so what we see, as with income tax, is mainly a pattern of tax rises at the top, making the system more progressive, or rather making it less regressive, because council tax is still much less than proportional to property value. While it made these changes, like the government south of the border, the Scottish Government has ducked the real reform that's needed to council tax. What should jump out of this chart, actually, is that council tax is still based on what properties were worth in 1991. That's now 30 years ago. It's a ridiculous way to operate a tax. It causes a lot of unfairness, and the longer you leave it, the worse it gets. But despite everyone agreeing that this is a problem, and commissioning yet another review that said they need to update it, there's no sign of the Scottish Government doing that any more than there is of the UK Government doing that. Where do the parties stand? Well, the only specific proposal on this is that the SNP want to exempt under 22-year-olds from council tax. Other than that, they say they want to reform council tax to make it fairer. Similarly, Labour wants to replace council tax with a fairer alternative based on property values and ability to pay. Now, clearly with both of those parties, we would have to wait and see what exactly they had in mind by that, but there is certainly room for improvement. The Conservatives, in contrast, say they wouldn't support any revaluation or overhaul of council tax in the current Parliament. What they want to see is the parties reach a consensus and put it to voters at the next election. And quite how people vote on the consensus isn't entirely clear to me. But in any case, by the next election, council tax will be 35 years out of date. And even if change is agreed then, it'll be even more out of date by the time any change was actually implemented. So this is really a rather disappointing lack of action. It would be quite important to see something happening on this in the coming parliamentary term. The equivalent of council tax for commercial property is business rates. And this chart shows business rates, tax bills, as a percentage of the annual rental value of a property. So there's no tax on the lowest value properties, and then the tax jumps up in stages for higher value properties. And we can compare this with the tax schedule in England and in Wales. And we can see that the relief for small businesses is significantly more generous in Scotland. Tax bills, again, at the bottom are significantly are lower. And they're actually lower most of the way up, but you will see that for the very highest value properties, which actually account for quite a large proportion of the revenue, business rates is marginally higher in Scotland than it is in England. The SNP, having in government already reduced business rates for lower value properties, now wants to reduce it for the highest value properties to match the level that's seen in England. The main effect of that, we think, would be to keep commercial rents higher than they would otherwise be, and so mainly benefit landlords rather than reducing the cost of premises for the firms that occupy them. The Conservatives are focused on small businesses in this manifesto, and they want to get rid of the sharp jumps in liability that currently mean that slightly more valuable properties can attract thousands of pounds more in tax, and instead phase in tax bills more gradually, as already happens, as you can see in England and Wales. And that would seem like an entirely sensible change. Labour's main proposal on business rates is to distinguish between different types of businesses. They'd like to see a 20% reduction in business rates for bricks and mortar shops, but a 20% increase for warehouses of particularly online retailers. Now, since there are lots more shops than there are warehouses, that would be a net cut in business rates, at least while the current system is in place. Both Labour and the Conservatives say they want a fundamental review of the business rates system, though as with council tax, we would have to see where those came out. The last major devolved tax is land and buildings transaction tax. That's the Scottish equivalent of stamp duty land tax in England and Northern Ireland, land transaction tax in Wales. And this chart shows you that, perhaps unsurprisingly by now, Scotland levies the highest tax in Britain on transactions of high value properties, but at least lower tax than in England, or though not Wales, for lower value transactions. Now, the only one of those three parties' manifestos that proposes to do anything with land and building transaction tax is the Conservatives, who want to increase the threshold at which it starts to be paid to £250,000, taking purchases below that level out of tax altogether and reducing the tax on purchases above £250,000 by up to £2,100 per transaction. Now, as we've argued many times before, the IFS taxing transactions is a particularly damaging way to raise revenue. So any reduction like this would make the tax system work more efficiently. But as with business rates, I point out that the effect of this tax cut would likely be to bid up property prices and so benefit existing property owners more than future buyers. So much for the existing devolved taxes. The SNP and Labour both also say they would like to explore the possibility of bringing in new taxes. For the SNP, that would mean a digital sales tax. Labour want to look at an additional alcohol tax, and also land value taxes, environmental taxes, and a range of optional additional taxes that local authorities would be allowed to levy. Turning to benefits, the Scottish Government since 2016 has introduced a number of changes that are partly about the way that benefits are assessed and paid rather than just their level. So they're giving universal credit claimants more flexibility in how they receive the money. And the changes that are due to come into disability benefits will be, eligibility will be assessed in a slightly different way. Both of these things should be improvements and make life easier for claimants if they can be delivered successfully and the benefits realised on the ground. But the Scottish Government's also introduced a number of new top-ups to means-tested benefits, primarily focusing on tenants in social housing, those caring for people with disabilities, and families with young children. The biggest of these is Scottish Child Payments, which is a new benefit introduced just a couple of months ago, which provides a top-up of £10 a week per child aged under 6 years old for families that are getting means-tested benefits. Now, since this is means-tested, you won't be surprised to see that the gains are concentrated among low-income households. Now, this is already due to be extended from children aged under 6 to children aged under 16 next year. All the parties are signed up to that. But on top of that, all of the parties also want to increase the level from £10 to £20 a week. The SNP and the Scottish Conservatives want to do that by the end of the Parliament. Labour want to do that by the end of next year, which therefore makes their offer slightly more generous. And because this is helping low-income families with children, these kinds of reforms would lift potentially thousands, even tens of thousands of children out of poverty, although campaigners have estimated that it wouldn't be enough to meet the Scottish Government's child poverty targets, which all the parties have signed up to. In terms of other benefits, all of the parties are also signed up to an expansion of carers allowance, although they all want to expand it in slightly different ways. But the SNP then wants to take steps towards introducing a guaranteed minimum income that all households' incomes would be topped up to. Now, we don't really know how radical a change that would be, because we don't know how high they would set the level of that minimum income guarantee. They also say that ideally they would like to have a universal basic income a flat rate payment to all citizens of Scotland, but they recognise that they don't have the power to do that at the moment. The Labour Party also wants to introduce a minimum income guarantee, but it then has, on top of that, a long list of more kind of concrete and specific benefit increases that it would like to introduce. I'm not going to go through them all individually, but the basic, of course, these would all be welcome for those people who would benefit from them. The obvious question is how they would be paid for. So to sum up, there are some commonalities between the parties' tax and benefit proposals, both on the benefits side and in the way that they've set out ambitions for income tax while leaving themselves some wiggle room. Beyond that, the SNP have few other major commitments for the coming Parliament, a couple of smaller changes to benefits, a slight reduction in business rates, but potentially looking at much more radical, longer-term changes. The Conservatives have an ambition for lower taxes, certainly on property transactions, but ideally also on income tax. And the Labour Party proposed significant expansion of the benefits system, as well as what amounts to a net cut to business rates. But they also want to look at replacing council tax and to explore a range of possible new taxes. But given how long it would take to bring in new taxes, even once they've got the power to do so, if they needed to raise revenue in the shorter term, the only thing they mention is the possibility of increasing income tax for the small group of people on more than £100,000 if they need to. So with that, I'll end and hand back to David to sum up.
Thank you, Stuart. So what do I think are the big takeaway messages from our analysis? Well, first, I think there's a clear Scottish model of the welfare state that all the larger parties have bought into to at least some extent. Now, this model involves a progressive tax and benefit policy to raise more from the top and give more to lower income households. Whilst the Conservatives say they would aim to reduce income tax at the top, they haven't said they would undo the council tax increases, for example. Alongside this progressive tax and benefit policy, this model also involves the provision of a wide range of universal services, free to all, with the sort of offerings of free school meals and additional free childcare coming on top of that. Now, of course, given it's free for all, that's actually somewhat less progressive than targeting resources just on those with the lowest incomes. This model is largely funded by the relatively higher levels of UK government funding the Scottish Government receives, not higher Scottish taxes. But it does mean a growing policy divergence with England. However, policy in England is still clearly a major reference point in Scottish debates. We can see that with income tax policy, both of the current policy with the tiny £20 gains that Stuart showed at the bottom, more a political statement really than a major change, but also the Conservatives' plans to go back to the UK system effectively. And it also can be seen in debates about NHS funding, with plans or proposals to pass on any increase in English NHS funding onto the Scottish NHS, rather than assess what the Scottish NHS itself needs to spend. I think, like England as well, tricky but sometimes necessary reform has been ducked on occasion. And that's most notably the case in council tax, where action really is needed in this coming Parliament. Now, there are a range of commonalities in parties' plans going forward as well. I think there's consensus on a number of key social policy issues: child payments, free school meals, childcare, carers allowance. Although the SNP and particularly Labour pledge more spending than the Conservatives. There's similarity actually in capital investment priorities something we haven't discussed in today's presentation because of a lack of time. Things like social housing, energy efficiency, digital infrastructure. I mean, it's perhaps not surprising given the challenges we face as a society. Unfortunately, they also share another thing in common, which I'd say is hiding from fiscal reality. Delivering the specific pledges they make are likely to mean tax rises or cuts elsewhere, unless the UK government significantly loosens its purse strings. And I think, certainly the SNP and Conservatives really do downplay the likely increases in NHS spending to flatter the amounts available for other proposals. But there are differences, I think, between the parties as well, some clear differences, and not only on the question of independence. SNP and Labour envisage a bigger welfare state, a national care service and free non-residential care, a range of new entitlements and increased benefits. So, for example, both offer free bus travel for young adults, digital devices for children. The SNP have free dentistry, free bikes. As Stuart said, Labour have a whole host of benefit increases. There's jobs, education, training guarantees, and aims and hints at minimum income guarantees and universal basic incomes. The Conservatives, on the other hand, their service and benefits offer is less expansive. And as Stuart said, instead, they aim at modest reductions in taxes, a commitment for land and buildings transactions tax, and an aim to reduce income tax to slightly below UK government levels. So whilst there still is this consistency and this consensus on some key elements of what we might call the Scottish model of the welfare state, there still are quite different visions for the long-term future of how that state would evolve. I think the kind of perhaps key takeaway is that delivering these visions in the context of COVID recovery, demographic change, and potentially a tight funding environment will mean difficult decisions on other taxes and other spending. And I think it's fair to say that Scotland's politicians are really failing to level with voters on the challenges that lie ahead. And with that, I think it's time for questions.
Great. Thank you very much, David and Stuart, for those insights. A huge wealth of material for us to mull over, and so many questions as a result. So we're now going to open it up to Q&A. Questions can be typed into Slido with the link on the IFS webpage where you joined the event today, or also on the YouTube channel. If you could type your question into the Q&A, then we'll get to as many as possible. There's a lot of people on the webinar today, so we'll do our best to get around as many questions as possible. But first of all, if I could hand over to you, Alison, to ask the first question, please.
Thanks, Graham, and let me just echo your comments that it's clear this is really important research and we're delighted to have funded it. And so to the first question. In your fiscal analysis, you state that core funding over the next Scottish parliamentary term is likely to be tight, given that the last UK budget implied 14 billion less on unprotected budgets. And against this backdrop, do you think the manifesto promises for the three parties stack up?
I'll come on that one if you don't mind, Stuart. So I think kind of it's fair to say that given the, certainly next year, 22-23 is going to be a very tight year for funding. Apart from NHS funding, given the current UK plans, I think we're looking at cuts to other spending rather than increases in other spending. So if, meeting, kind of the start of the rollout of these more generous pledges, I think, you would need to see, either, Scottish tax rises, accepting there'll be cuts, even bigger cuts to certain areas to pay for these new goodies, or you'd have to hope the UK government, substantially loosens its purse strings. I think some loosening of the purse strings is likely, especially next year, but probably not on the scale to meet these pledges. Looking further to the future, I think the budget, for the Scottish Government will then start to rise by more. But NHS funding, we really shouldn't underestimate how much that is likely to go up by, and social care funding as well. And that's going to leave relatively little to play with for other spending, let alone other pledges. So I think that, delivering, this sort of smorgasbord of policies and pledges that are being offered by some of the parties would require really difficult decisions on other things, taxes or spending, unless we really do see a big change in fiscal course at the UK level.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. A point you made, Stuart, was around introduction of new taxes, potentially the parties proposing introducing new taxes, digital sales tax potentially being, potentially one of those. How easy do you think it is for a Scottish government, a devolved government, to introduce new taxes into a wider UK context? And where do you see the potential opportunities and challenges?
Yeah, so I guess there are two slightly different questions. There's a legal question, which is what powers do they have to introduce new taxes, to which the answer is actually quite limited at the moment. And for the most part, the parties do acknowledge that, although the Labour manifesto seems simply to say that they would introduce a new tax on alcohol sales, despite the fact that I don't think that they have the power to do that. They need to request it, and the Westminster government may not grant it. But for the most part, the various new taxes that are being proposed, they acknowledge that they may not have the powers, and they talk about requesting the powers, which certainly is within their right to do. The second aspect of it is, well, if you had the powers, how easily could these things be implemented? Where I think it varies from case to case. So I think a digital sales tax would actually be really quite a hard thing to do. And clearly additional alcohol taxation is much more straightforward. Things like land value tax that was in Labour's manifesto, various environmental taxes are perhaps somewhere in between on that. And I think there's both an issue, a challenge as to how easy these things would be to do at all, but also the question of the capacity of the Scottish Government and Revenue Scotland and so on actually to implement things that would be challenging even for some of the world's biggest economies to do.
If I may come in there for a second, I think kind of on some of these ideas as well, I think kind of, I might actually just challenge some of the received wisdom on this. I might be a bit controversial now, perhaps, but, I think an online sales tax is something I'm seen as sort of leveling the playing field. I'm not sure it's entirely the case. I actually see that as somewhat tilting the playing field away from online sales towards bricks and mortar. I mean, I think if we're concerned about, the tax avoidance at the corporate level, the correct way to deal with that is, through the corporate tax system rather than kind of trying to play with the sales tax system. And actually, we've seen, with the Scottish government so far, a somewhat timidity to actually make use of the kind of full powers available to it that it currently has. There's already powers to kind of, fundamentally reform property taxes. Land tax is a tax they could introduce at the moment. Now, of course, different parties will have different plans, but radical changes mean, big winners, but also big losers. I think that's something that, can put a stall on these changes, even when the powers are devolved.
Thanks.
As to whether these things are a good idea is a longer conversation that we could have.
Okay, on to the next question. Following all the analysis that you've done, have you been left with the impression of a sort of uniquely different Scottish approach to public policy compared to the UK government? And if you have, do you think this looks likely to continue into the next parliamentary term?
Well, as I said in my kind of final summing up, I think there is, a sort of a Scottish model of the welfare state. I think on the tax and benefit side, as Stuart was saying, that it means taking, somewhat more from higher income and the richer Scots to, provide, higher benefits to lower income Scots. On the public service side, it actually is actually somewhat less progressive. It's kind of universal services for everyone. Free tuition, free personal care, free prescriptions, and then this, new list of proposals. So I think almost it's kind of, the model is, more progressive on tax and benefits. We will ensure, I guess, middle class support for the welfare state by making sure they also get free services as well. So I think that is the model. Now, the party's plans certainly, suggest they want to kind of continue down that route. The extent to which they kind of, continue to scale up this approach, varies. The Conservatives offer a bit more. Labour and SNP offer rather a lot more, going down this route. I think the kind of question, is not do the parties want to kind of do more of this, is can they afford more of this, given the fiscal context in the years ahead? And I think that's, a big question, whatever the constitutional status of Scotland.
Great. So just picking up that question about the constitutional status. So obviously independence or the prospects for a second referendum are central to the campaign at the moment. What's your latest research saying about the public finances of an independent Scotland, and where do you essentially see the opportunities and challenges from that?
Yes. So I think this probably kind of follows on from the figures that have appeared in the newspapers over the weekend from a conversation, a 5-minute conversation or an email I had with a journalist. And apparently there's a report coming out, which is news to me. But we may actually put something out later this week now. So looking at this, yes, I think clearly, for quite a while now, since the big fall in oil prices in the sort of mid-2010s, Scotland's underlying fiscal position has been relatively weaker than the UK as a whole. And that's because spending on public services and benefits is higher in Scotland than it is in the rest of the UK, but the taxes raised are actually slightly lower than in the rest of the UK. So, I think it's hard to avoid, you can't deny the fact that an independent Scotland would start life with a relatively high budget deficit, substantially higher than the rest of the UK. The SNP's Growth Commission 3 years ago now recognised this and set out a plan to bring that deficit down by holding down growth in spending. They didn't want to call it austerity, but it was effectively austerity. Now, since that Growth Commission reported, I think a couple of things have changed. The first is that clearly you've had the COVID crisis, which has blown a hole in the UK government's finances, but also blown a hole in the kind of Scottish underlying public finances. That would mean we're having to do a fiscal tightening at a UK level. Scotland would have to do that added on top of the one that was already there. I think the other thing that's changed is it's become clear that Brexit is a harder Brexit than we thought. And I think that means that the sort of issues around the border have become kind of sort more tricky since 2018 as well. So, I won't be kind of putting a number today. I might kind of put out a number later in the week. But it's clear that an independent Scotland would start life with a large deficit. It would need to get that down, and that would mean difficult choices. Now, that doesn't mean Scotland can't afford to be independent. Scotland's a relatively rich country, but it would need to make sure that it cut its cloth to fit the size of its own purse, rather than having fiscal transfers from the rest of the UK.
Thanks, David. And could I just one follow-up question that's come into the discussions as well is around the coordination of monetary and fiscal policy, and particularly in this crisis, the ability of having a central bank alongside to coordinate policy responses. What would the potential implications be of that whole debate around coordination for Scotland in terms of debates around currency, etc.? And do you see an advantage in having a central bank close at hand to help support the fiscal position in times of crisis?
I think that's a really interesting question, because I've heard sort of two arguments about the COVID crisis and what lessons we should draw from independent Scotland from that. So on the one hand, clearly we've seen massive borrowing during the COVID crisis, but actually some of that's going to be sustained. It's not just a small permanent hole in the public finances. So that means that the UK's fiscal position is weaker than we expected it to be a few years ago. And independent Scotland's position, which was already looking relatively tricky in the first few years, also looks weaker. One argument then is that makes it even more difficult. But I've also heard the argument that, well, actually, COVID has shown actually you can borrow significant amounts of money. UK government, has borrowed at least 15% of GDP in the last year. Why is Scotland worrying about 10% of GDP, further down the line? I think, there's I think the issue you raised there about, the role of central banking there, I think is very important. One of the ways in which UK government has been able to borrow so cheaply is because most of the actual borrowing over the last year has actually then been offset by the Bank of England buying up the bonds from the private sector. Now, an independent Scotland, if it didn't have its own central bank, it's not clear that that sort of monetary financing, which isn't a permanent solution to deficits. I'm definitely not an MMTer, but it can provide some support in the short term. So, I think an independent Scotland would have to think carefully, about the benefits of having an independent central bank, which can, if needed, provide that sort of monetary financing, that sort of quantitative easing type policy, versus the benefits of having, either the pound or perhaps the euro in order to kind of ease trade and reduce trade costs with its two largest trading partners.
Thanks, David. Can we turn our attention to the tax regime for a moment? So I think this will be a question for Stuart. Your analysis of the different tax regime in Scotland found it to be more progressive, because higher rate taxpayers pay more than their counterparts in England. I wanted to ask whether you found any evidence of a falling base of higher rate taxpayers in Scotland, because they have to pay more tax at payer. And coupled with that, somebody's asked on the forum, do you know specifically how many people pay income tax above the £100,000 band?
Okay, so let me take each of those. The second one's easier. No, we don't know exactly how many people there are above £100,000. The published figures that we've got, the latest ones are for 2018-19. So we know how many people there are above £150,000, so additional rate taxpayers. There are about 15,000 of those in Scotland. So that's, well, 0.6% of taxpayers, but only 0.3% of the population, because bear in mind, barely over half of Scottish residents have incomes high enough to pay income tax at all. So there are 15,000 people with incomes above £150,000. We also know how many higher rate taxpayers there are, so with incomes above about £43,000. There are 300,000 or so of those. So that's 7% of all adults, 1 in 8 taxpayers. So the number above £100,000, it'll be somewhere in the tens of thousands, but we don't have an exact number for that. In terms of the effect of higher and more progressive taxes on the Scottish tax base, it's clearly difficult to estimate that accurately. I guess two things I can say. One is that the Scottish government's done its own estimates, basically making assumptions about how responsive people are to higher taxes. Their estimate is that the £450 million extra revenue they get as a result of having this different income tax schedule would have been about 30% higher if it hadn't been for the effect of income tax on disincentives. So that's a significant chunk taken out of the revenue that you would get mechanically if it didn't have this effect on incentives. But it's not, it's nowhere near the point where you'd say, well, raising income taxes actually costs the Scottish government money. It's nowhere near that. I guess another thing you can look at is that while having the Scottish tax schedule rather than the UK one is estimated to raise around £450 million of revenue, that doesn't mean that income tax revenue in Scotland is that much higher than it would have been if there hadn't been devolution. Because one of the consequences of devolution is that when the Scottish income tax base, the number of taxpayers and taxable incomes, falls over time, relative to the rest of the UK, the Scottish government bears the cost of that. And we have seen the Scottish government losing a lot of the extra revenue from higher income tax because of that reduction in taxable incomes in Scotland relative to the rest of the UK. Now, it's possible, in fact, it's likely that some of that reduction in the income tax base in Scotland is going to be caused by the higher income tax rates. But I really don't think that's going to be most of it. It's going to be a contributory factor.
And then if you look at the kind of figures, basically what happened is there was kind of, a couple of years of quite weak earnings growth in Scotland that was actually, kind of at the average, not just kind of at the kind of levels where this higher rate income tax kind of kicked in. So I would agree with Stuart, clearly even the Scottish government recognises that higher tax rates will lead to sort of behavioural response and reduce the yield. But I don't think that, the kind of slowdown in Scottish tax revenues that we've seen in the last couple of years can largely be explained by that.
Okay, so we've had quite a lot of discussion around public spending priorities and tax, but we know that one of the other big issues in the election campaign is how to rebuild the economy after the COVID crisis. So perhaps it'd be quite useful maybe if you could give your thoughts on how innovative, how credible the plans are from the parties in terms of supporting businesses and creating jobs. You mentioned a bit about the kind of jobs guarantee scheme, but more broadly, what's your assessment of the plans of the parties about helping to support the economy?
Well, I think that's a really good question. If I may actually kind of add a little bit there, I think about more general COVID recovery as well as the business side of things. So the parties, do all kind of, recognise that there's a need for, economic, but also social and public service recovery from the COVID crisis. The scale of their ambitions on this and what they offer is substantially different. So I think it's fair to say that I think the SNP are kind of less, concrete on exactly what this would involve. The Conservatives have kind of a number of ideas. So, for example, they would have a continuation of partial business rates relief next year. There's some additional money for schools catch-up. Actually, the most generous offer to the NHS for catch-up this year from the Conservatives. Labour clearly have, by far the largest, sort of stimulus and support package. The sort of question there is whether it's affordable given the sort of the funding available to the Scottish government and the kind of the powers available to the Scottish government currently. On this issue about fiscal stimulus and kind of support for recovery, I think the sort of there's a challenge that that we're kind of that parties will be facing and that governments will be facing in the years ahead. And I think there's two aspects to this. The first is that it's not clear the extent to which a substantial fiscal stimulus will be required, or whether actually the economy will start to kind of come back of its own accord because of the kind of significant amounts of excess savings that people have built up over the last few years, and actually supply continuing to be kind of held back a bit by kind of ongoing social distancing. So one of the risks that could actually happen is if you try to pump loads more money into the economy whilst you still have that supply side constraint and people, loosening their own purse strings, you could actually cause a bit of a, inflationary, pressure. I think the other kind of question in relation to this is, as we start to withdraw support, on business rates, on other aspects, the furlough scheme at UK level, we want to be doing it in a way that doesn't push over those firms that are viable for the long term but are still facing constrained demand, but doesn't keep on effectively zombie firms that are not going to survive in the sort of the new normal, if you like. But I think there's a kind of a big challenge for the Scottish government and the UK government in doing this right. I think what I would be looking for in these plans is to kind of see, actually, are the plans achievable given the kind of current resources available? I think there are questions about that for Labour. The Conservatives probably just about, but it's obviously a less ambitious plan. The SNP it's unclear because they've sort of given at least detail on what their plans would involve, or that gives them the most wiggle room to see how funding and the situation evolves. That's the first thing I'd say. I think the second thing I'd say is that I think I would kind of see plans for recovery on the economy as being alongside plans for broader recovery. Because if we don't have recovery in the health service and in education and other public services, that might not show up immediately in the economy, but it can have big impacts on the economy down the line. So I think I would also say, let's look at the kind of plans for health, education. And I think, despite what I said about a tight funding environment, I think the evidence is that actually in these areas more might be needed than the parties are offering rather than less.
Thanks, David. And since you touched on education, is it fair to conclude from your analysis that the problem of failing attainment in Scotland is actually not caused by a lack of resource, and therefore perhaps other causes of this do need to be considered?
I think that's a really interesting question. And unfortunately, I don't have a great answer for it. I'm not an expert in education. I don't know what is going on in the Scottish education system. But I think what one can infer from the spending figures and at least some of the headline measures of performance is that whilst money certainly matters for the resources available, it matters for what can be offered in terms of teaching and extracurricular activities and support for learners, with things like education maintenance allowances and free tuition. It's not the be all and end all, certainly, for outcomes. So, spending on education has long been higher in Scotland than in England, as part of its more generally higher levels of public service spending. That gap has been growing over the last few years, but that's a period in which relative performance, at least on the surface, appears to have declined in Scotland. Why that is, I don't know. I mean, I know that there's been kind of suggestions about is it the curriculum? Has, for example, the Scottish model of higher education meant that caps on student numbers have prevented increases in people from low socioeconomic status actually going to university? It's free, but caps in numbers to kind of make that system affordable. Has that held back increases in participation? So I think there's a lot of questions there that I just have to admit I haven't had a chance to look into in detail at this stage, but I think they're really important questions for the coming Parliament. If you're spending substantially more on education than the rest of the UK, but not getting better outcomes, you do need to ask questions.
Great, and we've got time for one really short question right at the end. So one of your key points that you make today is that you're saying that the main political parties are not levelling up, or their plans don't have credibility with Scottish voters. How unique is that in an election? Is this something which is more of an issue in this Scottish election than you've seen in the past, or is this just something that when you do analysis of UK elections as well, that this is a conclusion that you always make?
So I think it's fair to say that we typically draw the conclusion that the party's plans, involve hidden trade-offs. They involve hidden potential costs on certain areas of tax or public spending that they've not been upfront to with voters. They may even sort of pencil in the 2010s. Actually the Conservatives in the 2010s are very clear they were planning to cut spending and cut welfare, but they didn't say which areas they were going to do. So I think it's always we always kind of are able to highlight issues with the particular policies and I guess a lack of transparency, at least, if not always a hole in their sort of plans for public spending and taxation. But I would say that I think the degree or the number of commitments and pledges and ambitions in some of the manifestos this time round, I think is more than we would typically see in other elections. And I think part of that actually reflects the fact that the the Scottish government, or the Scottish Parliament, has traditionally been a spending parliament rather than a revenue-raising parliament. I think the hope had been that by giving and devolving more fiscal and revenue powers, what we'd see is an increase in financial accountability and the ability of people to hold parties to account on not just kind of what's being spent, but how is it going to be raised and how you're going to afford that. I mean, at least in this election, I think that's a hope that's been dashed so far. I think it's fair to say that the hope that kind of more fiscal devolution would lead to kind of more responsibility in terms of managing the public finances of Scotland, based on these manifestos, I think there's more work to do on that.
Great, thanks, David. And I think that's where your research and what you've done is really helpful to help shine light on these trade-offs that exist. I'm conscious of time, so on behalf of the University of Glasgow, I'd like to thank Scottish Policy Foundation for their support for this work, and to David and Stuart for your presentations and engagement in the Q&A. Also to Ben Zaranko and Christine Farquharson for the research work as part of this initiative. If you're interested in this sort of research and debate, then take a look at the Scottish Policy Foundation's website, which has more material on what's happening in the election, and then also give us a follow on the University of Glasgow Social Sciences Twitter account, where you'll see more work and activities that were taking place in the university. My final word of thanks then is just to thank you all for joining us today in this session. Bye for now.